Good afternoon, everyone, or evening, or morning, or whenever you happen to be watching this. For me, it's in the afternoon. So this is an image from a park in Florida that is an allusion to Ponce de Leon's quest for the Fountain of Youth. And there's been historically, whether in fiction or to some degree in real life, there's always been this preoccupation in human society with aging and death. Those are two things. Now, most of you, I imagine, are pretty young and have a long life ahead of you. But even for those of us who are still pretty young, and I consider myself in that category, 32 is not that old, we're still interested in these kinds of topics. So let's start by thinking about the problem of aging. What exactly is it? Well, the basic problem is that as you get older, you lose biological function. You lose some of your personal autonomy in a lot of cases. You lose some of your cognitive functioning. Your life just gradually tends to get worse and eventually you die. Now, when I say it gets worse, I don't mean that it always overall gets worse qualitatively. There are some benefits to being older. So, say, for example, retiring from your job. But from a biological standpoint, it gets worse. Your body has a finite amount of time that it can function well. And suffering and death of any kind are sources of human misery. Remember, one of our ethical starting points from Schaefer Landau was that agony is morally bad, and so this is just an application of that. So it follows it's morally good to reduce suffering and death when you can, to extend people's life expectancy or to make the final years of their life feature as little pain as possible. So the thought is, if we could halt or reverse the aging process, we could eliminate a lot of suffering and prolong people's lives and thereby delay death. You can't, still can't prevent all death. Although Bostrom seems to be going in that direction, but we'll get to that in a minute. Now, what's interesting about this is it seems like a very basic kind of moral problem. Like, yeah, it seems like if we could eliminate aging, it'd be a good thing. But the real full story is not so simple. If you go back in human history, there is a long list of examples of people in fiction striving to achieve some form of immortality or to prolong their lives in some significant way. And for the most part, the interesting thing is that the portrayal of immortality is usually very bad. So these are just a random 6 examples that I came up with on my own. There are tons more. There's an entire Wikipedia entry that just lists dozens and dozens of these kinds of examples. Although interestingly, I think a couple of the ones I have are not on that list. So what are you going to do? So the Stroubrug's from Gulliver's Travels were this essentially immortal species that they still aged, but they never died. So eventually all of them lost all their mental faculties. So living as a Stroubrug did not seem like a good deal because your life after 80 or 85 or something like that really, really started to go downhill, and you couldn't die. So not the best situation. Ramon Fosca from the Simone de Beauvoir novel All Men Are Mortal is someone who is immortal, but it was actually a curse placed on this guy. I'm not super familiar with the story, but it is not a pleasant portrayal of immortality. Amelia Marty from the Macropolis Affair. Macropolis Affair is one of the most common examples you'll see in the philosophical literature of this. Basically, she took an elixir that allowed her to live forever as long as she kept taking it, and as she lives for hundreds and hundreds of years, she finds life to become very boring and tedious, and so she eventually decides to stop taking the elixir. Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, which I consider to be the best Indiana Jones movie of the 3 that exist and ought to exist, and the one that we will never speak of. There are various characters in that movie who are all trying to get immortality, and for the most part, it does not go well for any of them. Whether it be the Nazis themselves who are after the Holy Grail, or whether it be their sort of accomplices who are not Nazis themselves but just are using that connection as a means to further their own ends. The recent one of the recent Pirates of the Caribbean movies on Stranger Tides, Blackbeard is trying to find the fabled Fountain of Youth because he has seen a vision or a prophecy or something like that where he's going to be killed by a man with a peg leg. Ironically, by trying to find the Fountain of Youth, he actually sort of puts himself in the situation where that person kills him. So, sucks for you. I probably should have tagged that with spoilers, but whatever. It's a Pirates of the Caribbean movie. I mean, do you think that Blackbeard's going to kill Johnny Depp in that movie and win? Like, no, obviously not. Like, come on. And then the last one I threw on here was a character from a 1980s anime, fighting anime that I liked, like a precursor to these more modern ones like Bleach and the Dragon Ball series, called Yu Yu Hakusho, where there's actually a character named Elder Toguro who is so powerful that his regenerative abilities are so powerful that he can never die, and so one of the characters basically ensnares him in a hallucinogenic plant that makes him that basically feeds his brain sense data in the form of powerful hallucinations that as it drains his life force, but it can never drain his life force enough to kill him, so he's just basically trapped, attached to this plant, like hallucinating that he's in a fight with somebody that he can't kill. So yeah, just like a very like clearly a fate worse than death in my view. So it didn't work out well for anybody on this list. Pursuing immortality, not a good situation for anybody. And I've got clips from these last three examples that are up on Carmen if you want to look at them. So there's an obvious question here that we should ask, like, why is the outlook in popular fiction on immortality so bleak? Well, a lot of people think that the pursuit of immortality is in some way a reflection of bad character. So here we're kind of operating in the domain of virtue ethics, right? We're thinking about what kind of people we want to be. And the thought is, if you're trying to achieve immortality, something's probably wrong with your character. Maybe you're unwilling to accept your biological limits. Maybe you don't have humility, or maybe you're ungrateful for the life that you do have. Or, of course, in the case of like Blackbeard, for example, as well as like the Nazis in the Last Crusade and some of those other collaborators, they just want immortality because it represents power in some sort or another. I mean, Blackbeard is completely self-interested. He just wants to stay alive and keep running his crew and all that. If that's your desire for immortality, is just to achieve more power, that's obviously not a virtuous character trait. So typically these stories about immortality are designed to illustrate that either living forever would be worse than living a normal and natural human life, but also that the very pursuit of immortality itself seems like it involves a sort of corrupted motivation. So either way, not a good story. Bostrom's article is interesting because it's sort of like a counter fable. It's his attempt to do something, to make like a pop culture type story that he thinks more accurately captures how we should view aging and the aging process. Now, there is a link to a video of a fairly high quality animation that portrays essentially the entire fable, and for the most part uses direct quotes from Bostrom's article to do that. So here's just a very quick, 90-second synopsis. You've got a dragon tyrant that rules over a kingdom and essentially eats a portion of its population every single day. I think that in the story, like in the present day time of the fable itself, it's around 10,000 people a day that get eaten by the dragon. Over time, people in this society come to accept the dragon as an inevitable aspect of their existence, something that they can't do anything about. It's just there, you got to deal with it. But there's this sort of rebel group of scientists who thinks maybe that's not the case. Maybe there's a way that we could develop a weapon capable of defeating the dragon. And then most of the sort of philosophically interesting part of the story is the deliberation about what to do and whether or not it would be appropriate to try to defeat the dragon. and ultimately the king decides to do it. Thinks that they're gonna try to eliminate this constant background threat to their existence. And at the very end of the story, they succeed. They essentially manage to hit the dragon with a missile or equivalent or something like that. It's powerful enough to actually kill the beast, and as a result, they are all freed from this fate of inevitably being killed by the dragon. Now, Bostrom's story, being that it's a fable, it is essentially a type of argument by analogy. So, an argument by analogy has a very particular structure to it. I've actually got an alternative handout about this that I will pull up from my other window. Let's drag this over. So, an argument by analogy is essentially an argument that uses reasoning about one case or scenario to draw a conclusion about some different case or scenario. And this handout, much like the PowerPoint is that I'm using here, is also up on Carmen at this point. So you can consult this later on for your reference and reviewing for an exam and whatnot. But essentially, Bostrom's Fable has a bunch of real life parallels to what he thinks are actual circumstances are like. So in the story, the Dragon Tyrant is supposed to represent the aging process, or senescence, sort of the biological vocab term. And when they kill the Dragon Tyrant, that's supposed to represent halting or reversing the aging process. The people who are fed to the Dragon Tyrant represent people who die as a result of the aging process, and the Dragonologists, which is the group in his story, the group of people who are trying to figure out a way to defeat the dragon, these are the transhumanists, or the people who are in favor. Transhumanists are people who are in favor of using human enhancement to radically alter humans' genetic and biological limitations. And their counterpart in real life is the bioconservatives, which we'll focus on. The next of these lectures will be all about bioconservatism, and we'll be focusing on one of the most prominent works of the bioconservative movement, which is Michael Sandel's views. He's got an Atlantic article, which was an assigned reading, but it's all based on a book that he wrote around I think 2009, something like that. But I was getting ahead of myself. I'm just pointing that out because the king's morality advisor, who disagrees with the Dragonologist, he is clearly designed to be a parallel to a lot of the bioconservatives. And in particular, I think that it's almost designed to be a direct match to a guy named Leon Cass, who was a very staunch bioconservative who had some significant influence in the country between 2000 and 2010 as a part of the President George W. Bush's Council on Bioethics. I believe he was the head of it. So Leon Cass and the bioconservatives are basically who's represented by the King's Morality Advisor, and they are very skeptical about the Dragonologist plan. They think that this represents, a serious moral mistake for a number of different reasons. The king, of course, just represents political leaders in general. I don't think he's designed to be any specific political leader. If you want to think of him as like the equivalent of the president of the United States, whatever, that's fine. But I don't think there was anything intended by that. And the King's Dragon Administration representative, this is a little hazier to figure out when you read the story, but this is designed to parallel the various groups of people who benefit in some way from the aging process, like economically or in some other way. So you've got all of these people. You've got obviously medical practitioners whose entire careers are based on easing pain and suffering. If you work in a hospice care center, for example, if there was no aging process, that whole profession just doesn't exist. Same, funeral home directors kind of rely on people dying for them to make a living, and these are like legitimate social functions, and there are plenty of others, but there's also, of course, charlatans who sell miracle cures for aging and other things that are basically just preying on people's fear of death or people's desire to look or feel younger again. But of course, what they're selling is just quackery. It's nonsense. None of these things actually work. And interestingly, there's a young boy that speaks up in the town hall meeting where all of these parties are discussing what to do about the dragon. And it's this young boy who speaks up, who just says, look, the dragon's bad. You know, he ate my grandma. It's just bad for people to live in fear and to die. And this is designed to be, in Bostrom's view, like the correct view, the voice of moral reason. Just like, look, don't overthink this. It's bad to suffer and die, and that's all there is to it. And so, of course, the moral of the story is supposed to be the way that it plays out. We should try to halt or reverse the aging process, despite objections from these kinds of people and these kinds of people. That's supposed to be the takeaway. So here's the structure that analogical arguments tend to have, at least if we're talking about ethical issues. We're talking about, normative claims about what we should do or what policy we ought to enact or something like that. So first you'll have a setup where you say scenario A is just like scenario B. In scenario A, we should take the following action, or we should enact the following policy, or we should act this particular way. So, since scenario B is just like scenario A, we should do the same thing, or something similar. So, just as the citizens of the kingdom should have destroyed the dragon, we should likewise halt the aging process, or reverse the aging process, or do something to at least mitigate the suffering and death that comes from the aging process. Now that goes into Mackey. So I believe the relevant, here's the flaw with these kinds of arguments. Anytime you got an argument by analogy, the key to finding a flaw in it is to identify relevant dissimilarities between the two cases. So in other words, what you're going to be challenging is this particular, you're either going to directly challenge this and just say, no, actually scenario A is not that similar to scenario B. You could also, of course, say, well, the diagnosis of scenario A is wrong. So you could react to Bostrom's Fable by saying, if you wanted to reject his view, you could say, actually, I don't think it was a good idea for the villagers to kill the dragon. That, I think, is going to be a tough sell. I think that's going to be hard, the way he sets up the story. I think it's going to be hard to seriously maintain that kind of position. So if something's wrong with Bostrom's case, I think it's going to be here. It's going to be, well, there are differences between the situation the villagers were in and the real-world situation with respect to aging. And I wrote down a few of those. Most of these came up in discussion last semester when we talked about this article. So here were some things that people mentioned. Death in the Fable doesn't appear to be a normal part of normal human life. There's no mention of people dying other than getting eaten by the dragon. Maybe they happen, maybe they don't. This is just sort of like not covered by Bostrom's Fable. But in either case, it seems like the main cause of death in the Fable isn't a result of the natural human lifespan or human evolutionary history. It's just sort of a weird anomaly of sorts. Namely that this dragon just happens to live in this area and chill out on this mountain and wants to be fed all the time. Related to that, the dragon has some degree of agency. Like, obviously it's able to make a deal with the people. So it's got some level of rational agency, and it seems to be clearly evil because it's killing 10,000 people a day. The aging process has no agency, isn't good or evil. It's just sort of a part of our biological existence. So this is one reason why you could say, well, the dragon is an instance of, like, this involves a great deal. What the dragon is doing involves a lot of injustice, but there's nothing unjust about the aging process. So that might give you a reason to say the dragon should be overthrown, but the aging process is morally neutral, so it maybe doesn't have the same kind of gravitas behind it as an evil. I mean, this is why he calls it the Dragon Tyrant, right? It's the tyrant part that's really It's really a problem in this context. Another big one. The technology to fight the dragon already exists in the Fable, but the technology to harder reverse aging doesn't exist. And there's a lot of optimism that this technology like this is achievable. But I will point out that optimism is several decades old at this point. And I don't know, I think it's fair to say that we've been able to obviously extend human life longer, but this has not been a result of reversing the aging process or halting it or anything like that. It's been a result of improved medical technologies to tackle the disease and other ailments that the elderly tend to have very late in life. It's not like we halted the aging process to do it. It's just we can deal with the diseases associated with aging a little bit better. So this one, to me, this is a really big one, a really big dissimilarity, because obviously if we invest heavily in pursuit of anti-aging technology, that's time, resources, money, etc., that we're not putting into other causes that also need to be addressed. So that's money that we could be putting towards, say, fighting climate change, or addressing famine in the third world, or trying to do something about biodiversity loss, or any of a myriad, or there are other kinds of, just in the field of healthcare, there are plenty of other interventions that would could make a big difference in minimizing the suffering of a lot of people. So if you're going to invest resources in technology to halt or reverse aging, and it's not possible to do, that could wind up just being a huge waste of time and other resources. So the fact that the technology to fight the dragon already existed in the Fable and had already been discovered, that's a significant fact, and I think Bostrom downplays that a little too much in his reconstruction. Something else that was pointed out, this was something that a student came up with. I hadn't thought about this until last semester. We don't really know what the economic system of the kingdom in the Fable really is, but in our own system, the absence of aging would seem to create problems with the accumulation of wealth, because the longer that you live, the more and more you're in possession of whatever your fortune is. And so if you just have all that money and you never die, and because especially in our society where money seems to be sort of a prerequisite to having certain forms of influence and political power, you worry that the same like 1% of the population will have this disproportionate influence more or less forever, and that social stratification, which is your ability to kind of move up from different classes in society, so to move up from being like impoverished to being middle class, or middle class to being upper class, or upper class to being like in that elite wealthy class. Worry is social stratification will become more pronounced, and it will be much harder for you to move up those different tiers, because people will be holding on to their money for so much longer. There are also concerns about the equitable distribution of anti-aging technology. How would everyone have access to it? Because I wonder, would this wind up coming on the market as there's some kind of special technological procedure, but it's like $1 million to have done, and so what you've got is long lifespans become a privilege associated with being rich. That seems to introduce new that solves maybe some ethical concerns about the aging process by introducing a whole new range of ethical concerns about how inegalitarian it is. So, and the Fable also doesn't say much about population size. The kingdom seems to have some kind of a stable population. They might even still be growing despite the dragon, offing 10,000 people a day. It's not really clear. But we're obviously already battling problems with population size. This came up last semester, but especially from my point of view, this is even more true now, because I literally have a book coming out on this topic. If you were to just not have people dying of old age anymore, then you would need to have population stability. So a population, in other words, that did not grow at all and just stayed at its current level. You would need to have a fertility rate of something like 0.05 births per fertile woman, and even in the lowest it is, I think, in any country in the world is still above 1, somewhere in between 1 and 1.4, I believe. I haven't looked at the projections in a while on that end of the spectrum, but you're nowhere near close to that rate. So if you had people just not dying from aging, if you actually eliminated it, you would see an immediate, within 1 to 2 generations, you would see an incredible spike in population growth. And we've already got almost 8 billion people, and there's pretty compelling evidence that we're already putting too much stress on background ecosystems and things like that as it is. So I don't know. That's something that I also think Bostrom didn't fully acknowledge. It doesn't seem like it's part of his fable, but it is clearly part of our real world circumstances. So I think there are other things, by the way. That wasn't an exhaustive list. Some of you may have picked up on differences that aren't listed there that may be morally relevant. I'm just highlighting them to give you an idea of the strategy. What's the strategy for dealing with an analogical argument like this? Well, if we want to show that the argument doesn't work, we need to come up, in most cases, you're going to need to come up with a morally significant difference between scenario A and scenario B. So a morally significant difference between Bostrom's fable and our actual situation with respect to anti-aging medicine. So that's Bostrom. Let's talk Mackey. There is a lot to dig into with Mackey. I'm going to try to just kind of breeze through this laundry list of different arguments that he assesses. He does say some stuff also about kind of the state of anti-aging medication, but his article was written in 2003. So a lot of that stuff I think is not that important for our purposes, because whatever he says, we're way past that point now. There have been new developments. The empirical side of the issue is not so much what we're concerned with here. We're asking the question, should this be an area where we're investing our resources? Should this be something that would be morally good to pursue? Those are the kinds of questions we're interested in. This is not, we're not dwelling a whole lot on what is the actual state of the science related to anti-aging medicine. I mean, the short version, of course, is we don't have the technology yet, so it'd really be more of a question of how far have we progressed, and even then, I imagine it would be kind of speculative. I don't think anybody totally knows how close or far away we are from genuine anti-aging medication. So Mackey doesn't give you any counter fable or anything like that, but his treatment of this topic is way more philosophically rigorous than Bostrom's. He does a really good job of surveying different arguments on both sides of the issue. His main position is actually pretty much the same as Bostrom's. He thinks we should pursue anti-aging medicine. He doesn't. I don't remember him saying technology specifically in addition to that, but at a minimum, we should definitely be trying to develop medicine that would halt or reverse the aging process. So the way this is set up is I'm basically just, we've got, I think, 7 arguments against the pursuit of this medicine, and then he, at the end of the article, offers 4 general moral considerations that he thinks count in favor of pursuing anti-aging medicine. And the overall takeaway is supposed to be, yes, Mackey, we agree, we should pursue this medicine. So first argument to consider: anti-aging medicine would only benefit the wealthy; the poor would be left to die. It's a good one to start with, because that was one of the last things that I mentioned in talking about Bostrom, the difference between Bostrom's fable and our real-world situation. The first thing he says is he thinks it's wrong to look at the issue as if we're making a trade-off between pursuing anti-age medication and funding other efforts to reduce human suffering. He thinks we can do these things simultaneously. The other thing he says, which is a little more practical, is he says insurance companies would be highly incentivized to cover anti-age medicine. So it's not the case that just the wealthy would be able to afford this medicine if it was available, because insurance companies would want to cover this medicine because it would radically decrease the chances of you getting some of these diseases that are associated with the aging process. Onset of diseases like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, for example, would be far, far lower. Your chances of getting cancer would be far, far lower. So it would be in insurance companies' own interests to get that medicine to their customers, so that they don't have as many claims as much medical cover. They don't have as much medical coverage that they have to deal with. Second argument: anti-aging medicine is a fantasy that certain people are promoting just to advance their own careers or deceive people with fraudulent miracle cures. So this is kind of the skeptical argument, like, is this even possible? Is this really something we could do? And Mackey essentially says, look, this just gets the facts wrong. There are lots of medical professionals that are fairly optimistic that we can one day arrive at this technology. We're still a ways away, but it is on the horizon. Now, I do mention here that the technological feasibility of anti-aging has become greater because there has been some progress, but it still isn't here. It's still kind of up in the air, I think, how far we can go with this. Because there's a big difference between decelerating the aging process and halting it completely, or especially reversing it. So if you decelerate it, that just means people will live a little bit longer, or they'll live about the same age, but they'll have increased function until they die. But if you were actually able to halt the aging process, then you would start to see much more radical effects, where now people could be living hundreds of years instead of around life expectancy of around 80. You could actually start to see people live for hundreds of years, because the only way that you would die under those kinds of conditions would be if you got some kind of fluky illness that had nothing to do with age, or if you got in a car accident, or it would have to be a sort of a tragedy in order for you to die. So the third argument here is that it's wrong to try to dominate nature or otherwise manipulate it for our benefit. This is kind of represents this playing God notion, that it's a bad thing to play God. It's a bad thing to manipulate biological limitations for your own self-interest. Here are his responses. First, Mackey doesn't think that humans have necessarily a natural desire to die, right? If anything, it seems like humans have a natural desire not to die. They want to survive as long as possible. We're kind of biologically hardwired to do that. The other thing that he mentions briefly, and this would I think be the more decisive response, the fact that something is natural does not make it good. There are all kinds of things in the world that are natural that are in various ways very bad. Disease itself is natural, but it seems like a very good thing to limit or outright eliminate disease. Do not give me any arguments that this COVID-19 nonsense is good because it's natural. No one's going to buy that nonsense. That's a bullshit argument. So he also mentions the overpopulation one. This was back in 2003, so the numbers are very different. We were about 2 billion people less at that time. Not quite that much, but close. We were not that far past 6 billion, I think, in 2003. So here's what he says about this. So the concern is anti-aging medicine would lead to overpopulation, because the death rates would go way down, and so you'd have people living much longer, and so population would go up as a result. First, he says progress in anti-aging medicine, it's going to be slow, so it's not like all of a sudden everybody's just going to be living for hundreds of years. You're not going to have any kind of significant effect on global population in the short term. I think he's exactly right about that. Given what's happened, in the 20 years since, there has been some progress, but it has been fairly slow, and it does seem like if this medicine ever becomes available, it's going to be it's probably not going to have a huge effect right away anyway, even if something got on the shelves. The other thing he says is that the notion that the old, or in other words, elderly people, should not hog the resources of the young is callously ageist. So ageism is a form of discrimination based on age. It's designed to, when people use this term, they're trying to draw a parallel to racism, sexism, those kinds of things. So the idea is that being an ageist is equally morally bad, because you're just discriminating on people based on their age and based on nothing else. So he thinks, the old should be entitled to their fair share of resources to keep them alive. There's nothing wrong with that. So the idea that, oh, we shouldn't allow people to live past a certain age because, then there won't be any, there won't, those resources belong to the kids, that kind of thing. He just flat out rejects that view. I think this might not be the most charitable interpretation of that argument, though, because the issue is that elderly people tend to take up a disproportionate amount of resources. It takes a lot of medical resources and money to keep a person who's sick at, say, 82 alive for another 2 years. A lot more resources than it typically does to keep someone who's, say, 25 alive for another 2 years, even if they had the same medical condition. So for somebody who's in their mid to late 80s, pneumonia, for example, could be fatal very easily for someone at that age. Whereas even a really serious acute case of pneumonia in someone who's, say, 30 would almost never be fatal. It would just be really, really inconvenient. So I don't know. I'm not totally convinced that it's just callously ageist to be concerned about the disproportionate use of resources by the elderly in this kind of scenario. Fifth argument against anti-aging medicine. Life itself loses its value in the absence of a natural timeline because it becomes tedious. So this is kind of an allusion to some of those pop culture examples I started out with. Most obviously, the Macropolis affair. Right. The concern is if you live past a certain point, you're just going to kind of get bored. Life's going to get very repetitive. It's going to become very tedious. You're going to have done all the things that you want to do, and so living is not that beneficial at that point. Oh, and it appears I never... So now, through the magical power of editing, this slide is as it was meant to be. So, essentially, there's the main response that Mackey makes is that he thinks that the best interpretation of this argument is that we might just come to cherish life's value less if we're living for, say, 150 years instead of 80. That we might come to value that time in those years a little bit less day to day than we do otherwise. But he doesn't think he does not think that taking life for granted in that context would be overall a bad thing. Like he thinks it's good to have that kind of security. It's good to know that something is so secure for you that you can take it for granted. He kind of he draws an analogy to like someone who, like a child who takes their parents' love for granted. It's good that they take their parents' love for granted because that means that their parents' love is readily available for them, and that's the kind of context we want. He thinks it's the same sort of thing here. We should want a context where people can live a long time and kind of take that for granted. He does also point out that how much you value your life doesn't neatly correlate with age. There are plenty of people who are very, very old who value their life really, really highly. There are plenty of younger people who are, for various reasons, unhappy with the way that their life is going and don't value it a whole lot. So it's not like because you grow older you come to value life less. The other thing he mentions briefly is that we've got all these different religions that posit various kinds of afterlives, and he interprets that as evidence that a lot of people really do want to live longer than nature typically allows. Now, the sixth argument is kind of getting back into that virtue ethical territory, right? The thought is the pursuit of anti-aging medicine reflects some kind of a glorification of youth and a distaste for the elderly. This seems like a character trait that's not so great. It's something we should reject, so we shouldn't pursue this kind of medicine. Here's what he says in response. First, there are reasons to prefer to slow the aging process that have nothing to do with glorifying youth. And second, when he fleshes that out a little bit more, he just says, look, people just don't want to die. There's nothing unvirtuous about that. There's nothing wrong with wanting to continue surviving. And so if your motive is just simply, look, I don't have any desire to relive the glory days of my youth. It's just I'd rather not die. Well, that doesn't really seem like an attitude that we should reject. That seems reasonable. Death is bad. Not unreasonable to want to keep living. And the last one, there's a concern that anti-aging... Hold on, did I skip one? I feel like I skipped one. We did that one. Did that one. Oh, no, we didn't. Okay. Nope, we're fine. We're on track. So this last one is concern that anti-aging medication would extend the lives of the elderly at the expense of the young and impede intergenerational transitions of leadership. So this one is a little bit more complex in some ways because it has to do with kind of thinking about, in part, the political ramifications of what it would be like to live in a society where lifespans were dramatically increased. And the concern is that you would have the same people in positions of political power for a really, really long time. It's particularly apt to be thinking about this now because it's looking very likely in this country that the next presidential election will be between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, and whoever wins that election, if that's how it goes, either one of those people would be the oldest president ever to serve in that office. And these are both so not only are they both old, but on the Democratic side, the primary is down to Biden and Sanders, Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden, and both of them are really, really old. Sanders is even older than Biden. I think Sanders is 78, and Joe Biden 77. So, and those guys have been around, in the political domain forever. And then, so this kind of got me to thinking, like, oh Lord, could we be seeing Bernie Sanders, in this alternative universe where we have this medicine? Is Bernie Sanders still trying to run for president in the primaries at like 150? Because he seems like the kind of guy that would do that. Would that be our fate, where it's just like the same, 5 or 6 people vying for political power for centuries on end? Now, this is one of the few... I've already made a couple of quibbles here and there with Mackey's responses, but this is an argument where I just don't think he really appreciates what the argument actually is. I think he makes some mistakes here. He actually says that he thinks this argument is based on the idea that old people, owe it to the young to step aside, and that, you need young people coming in with fresh ideas. He thinks that's not true. Like, old people can have fresh ideas. He also says, older people who are taking these anti-aging meds are probably going to be very open to new ideas, given that would be an emerging technology that, at least initially, would probably be fairly risky to take. But this isn't what the objection's about to me when I read it. He has a quote in here from Francis Fukuyama, and what Fukuyama says is, what he quotes him as saying, people at the top of social hierarchies generally do not want to lose status or power and will often use their considerable influence to protect their positions. This is on page 198 of the article if you want to look it up. And what that's pointing to is the fact that people who are older tend, as you get older and you have more experiences and you meet more people, you tend to acquire more influence. And you also tend to acquire more professional expertise. And so what Fukuyama is concerned about is you're going to essentially get in a position where you're going to have the same sort of inner cohort of people running certain organizations, whether we're talking political organizations or just more general professional organizations. You're going to have those people basically set the agenda for this extraordinary length of time. And it's going to be very, very difficult to enact change under those social change under those conditions. That has nothing to do with this idea that old people can't have fresh ideas. Of course they can have fresh ideas. The problem is the power is not... The worry is that the power is going to be so unevenly distributed, and it's going to be condensed into this one tiny group of super old, really influential people. That doesn't seem like a great outcome, politically speaking, particularly if you've got if these people have entrenched interests that they want to protect, and those interests run counter to certain other social goods that need to be promoted. One of the most obvious examples of this is the fossil fuel industry. Lots of people have a vested interest in economic interest in maintaining the fossil fuel industry, but the maintenance of the fossil fuel industry is what continues to propel the average increase in the average annual increase in global temperature. So something's got to give there. You've got to have some, because if you don't change something about the current system, even though it means some people's financial interests will be set back, the long-term financial interests of everybody are going to be made worse off in various ways, and you're just going to have widespread environmental degradation and human suffering. So the worry is you're going to have more problems like that come up, where because you've got people with entrenched interests, they're going to be resistant to change when it's needed. I'm just not convinced that this response actually tracks what the objection is supposed to be. This is not to say that this is necessarily that this argument 7 is like a decisive consideration against anti-aging medication. I just don't think that what Mackey has said really addresses what the real issue here is. And then to close it off, let's look at the 4 considerations that he says. I don't think this part of the paper is as interesting as his appraisal of the different objections to anti-aging medicine. But here are the 4 considerations that he mentions in favor of this kind of medicine. First, he appeals to a principle of beneficence. He says, preventing disease and delaying death reduce human suffering and thereby make the world a better place. So it's a good thing on these grounds to pursue the medicine. He also mentions efficiency. He says anti-aging medicine would reduce the rates of disease, and that would make medical care more efficient. We would be able to more effectively give treatments to those who need them in other areas, in other contexts, because there'd be fewer people in need in general, and so we wouldn't have such a burdened healthcare system. He thinks that anti-aging medicine would increase people's range of medical choices, so it improves their autonomy in a certain way, even if that's a limited kind of improvement. He rejects the paternalistic line where we should protect people from having access to this kind of medication, like for their own benefit. He's not a fan of paternalism based on what he says in the article. And finally, he just says, anti-aging medicine would make some people's lives significantly better. For what it's worth, I don't think there is much difference between beneficence, efficiency, and quality of life here. All of these are just examples of how they're just different ways of cashing out the idea that anti-aging medicine has the potential to alleviate a lot of human suffering. And that seems correct. I think if the medicine if it existed, if it was affordable and it was effective, I think it would do those sorts of things. So breaking this down, I think, into 3 different ideas doesn't accomplish much. I really think this is all just one general point. It would reduce suffering, and then the second point is it would increase patient autonomy. Those seem to me to be the 2 main considerations: reduce suffering, increase autonomy. But I think that it's pretty clear that it would do both those things if it existed. So the question then is, are there other moral considerations in play, like some of the objections that he had considered, that give us reason to reject the pursuit of this medicine, even though it would have some benefits? Are there some overriding considerations that should make us hesitant to pursue this kind of medicine? And that's about where things stand on this, at least through our 2 readings. So I'll leave you to complete whatever assignments remain about this material and to think this issue through a little bit more on your own.